Great. So good morning, everybody. My name's Anne McNeil. I work here at King's. And well done for all coming, looking so sprightly this morning on the back of the rooftop terrace event last night. And I want to extend my thanks to and congratulations to Leonie, Sharon et al. For a wonderful conference they've staged so far. Okay, not everything we do in academia is enjoyable. But I have to say that introducing Professor Jamie Brown as a keynote speaker gives me great pleasure. Jamie works also not very far from here at University College London, so great to have a London speaker at a London conference. Now, Jamie did his undergraduate and PhD at the University of Cambridge, and his PhD was in experimental psychology, and he was examining functional exploration of implicit and explicit learning with a focus on autism spectrum disorder, which is a really important area of research. But fortunately, his interest in learning mechanisms and how they apply to real-world problems brought him to addiction, and indeed to Professor Robert West's, the first edition of his book, The Theory of Addiction. And it was on the back of that when he saw a job advertised at University College London, UCL, in 2010, Jamie applied for the position. And of course, you could say it's all history after that. But I think we should thank Robert, if he's here, for enticing Jamie into our field. In 2010, so just a mere 10 years later, he was appointed as Professor of Behavioural Science and Health at UCL. And reading your CV, Jamie, I can see why you've had this stellar rise. It belies your leadership, your productivity, your commitment and your enthusiasm to our field. It actually made me quite exhausted reading it. I had absolutely no idea that you were involved in so many multi-million-pound grants. You had so many important roles on editorial committees, grant committees, and all the other sorts of committees that there are. And you've rightly won lots of awards. And just to mention one, because we're here at SRNT, Jamie was awarded the status of SRNT Fellow last year. And for those of you that don't know, that's a distinction conferred by the Society on members in recognition of outstanding contributions to the field of nicotine and tobacco research, as well as service to our society, SRNT. In terms of productivity, Jamie published 85 publications in the last 2 years alone, and they're all really interesting articles. Don't know how you do it. And then thirdly, your knowledge, your extensive knowledge, means that you're often called upon to give advice to parliamentary committees and regulatory committees. And in fact, you're my go-to person as well if I need advice about what's happening nationally with the national data, if I have a query. And despite all of your commitments, and I know you're juggling a young family, you are never too busy to respond, and your responses are always very thoughtful and very considered. You put me to shame in that respect. I'm the opposite. But I was also really pleased to learn that Jamie has another string to his bow. So I was very lucky just to be able to watch my son play football. He's a UCL alumni. And there on the pitch, lo and behold, Jamie was careering around like a young buck, marshalling the defence. And I was really quite worried that he was going to be talent spotted by his favoured club, Tottenham Hotspurs. Now, when I asked Jamie if there was anything he wanted me to say, there were two things. First, not to mention the Champions League final in 2019 between Liverpool, those of you who know me from Liverpool, and Tottenham. So, of course, I won't mention that, Jamie. And secondly, that you were one cog in a great UCL and UK team over the years. And that really sums Jamie up. He's incredibly modest and incredibly self-effacing. Now, the logistics for the conference means that we won't, unfortunately, be able to take questions after the keynote, but I know Jamie is really keen to follow up with individuals afterwards, so please do that. And I don't want to take up any more time, so please join me in thanking Jamie and welcoming him to give his keynote.
Right, good morning. Thanks very much for that very generous, slightly embarrassing introduction, Anne. And obviously you didn't mention that final. And thanks everyone for turning out for this 9 a.m. start, as Anne said, especially after welcome drinks. I hope everyone enjoyed the conference yesterday. My personal highlight was the debate. I thought that was a really great innovation. Although with my good friend and the highly competitive Leon Shahab proving triumphant, I fear I shall never hear the end of it. For the last week, he's been regularly popping his head around my office door, sometimes mid-meeting, with his latest idea, insisting this one would clinch the debate for him. But anyway, I too want to begin by thanking the scientific committee for the invitation. Really delighted to be here and very humbled to be giving a keynote presentation at SRNT-E. It's such a great organisation. I always come away from these meetings feeling really inspired by the fantastic research going on across Europe and also the sense of community and collegiality I think we have here. I was trying to remember, I think my first one was about 10 years ago now in Helsinki, and I remember a fantastic pre-conference workshop there by I think Maciej Gonowicz and Natalie Walker, and it was really rich in new findings about e-cigarettes. Which was some testament to SRNT-E that it was able to host such a cutting-edge workshop at that very early stage in their evolution. I remember returning and being inspired to start drafting some of our first protocols for some of our earliest toolkit papers on e-cigarettes. So speaking of which, today I'd like to speak to the value of frequent and rapid surveillance, especially in a fast-changing tobacco control landscape, by providing examples and insights from our long-term monthly population survey in England called the Smoking Toolkit Study. Here's our statement of funding and declaration of interest. Of particular note, I think, is we've received no funds from e-cigarette manufacturers or tobacco industry, and I'm of course grateful to all our funders, especially CR UK and the UK PRP. As Anne said, I'd also like to start by acknowledging the whole research group at UCL. As we all know, good science is very much a team effort, and I'm presenting on behalf of all those pictured here and extremely grateful for all their hard work and talent. As Anne predicted, I'd want to make a special mention to Robert West here, not only for his foresight in establishing our Smoking Toolkit study back in 2006, but also for giving me my first postdoc job 13, 14 years ago and being a constant source of inspiration and wisdom ever since. Finally, our efforts are collaborative well beyond UCL, and that's the secret to the productivity. And I think here is more or less a complete list of our many toolkit co-authors, although apologies for any errors or omissions. I clearly don't have time to go through everyone, but I'd particularly like to acknowledge Anne McNeil, Leonie Brose, Linda Bald, Daniel Kotz, Toby Raupak and John Holmes, who've all been particularly fantastic toolkit and frequent collaborators over the years. Right, sorry, it's feeling a bit like an Oscars acceptance speech, but here comes the science. So my aims for today are to first introduce our toolkit study before moving to persuade you of the value of establishing frequent and rapid surveillance of smoking and related behaviour. I want to do this by example and considering 3 cases where I think toolkit has been influential on tobacco control science and policy in the UK and sometimes beyond. The first is to demonstrate how this type of study enables rapid evaluation and sometimes policy impact by considering our evaluation of the mass media campaign Stoptober. Second is to show how the toolkit's provided us with many early insights into fast emerging and evolving phenomena, obviously most notably e-cigarettes over the last 10 years, and I'll have a focus on recent developments in the use of new disposable devices. Finally, I'll show how the study enables different approaches to the real-world evaluation of cessation treatments and how we use these, together with RCT evidence, to triangulate on estimates for the effectiveness of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation in England. Now, some of you may be wondering, why am I making this case? Surely the value of frequent and rapid surveillance is pretty self-evident, especially after COVID and to this audience, but it does require a lot of investment from funders. It may require a little patience to yield dividends. It becomes more useful as the length of the series extends and as anticipated real-world events unfold. So hopefully when these specific examples are brought together, which we rarely do, it can help make these points a bit more forcefully, and maybe some of you will be able to go away and use this to make cases all over Europe. And of course, I also hope that the examples are instructive in their own right, and they do include some of our very latest findings too. Okay, so what is the Smoking Toolkit study? It's a national surveillance program involving a series of monthly cross-sectional household surveys of representative samples of adults in England that aims to provide insight into population-wide influences on smoking and smoking cessation. Each month, a new sample of approximately 1,700 adults in England complete computer-assisted household survey with a trained Ipsos Mori interviewer that includes a range of questions about their smoking, attempts to quit, vaping, and other related behaviour. Selection is by a hybrid between random location and also quota sampling. And in comparison with other national probability surveys and also some sales data, the methods have been shown to result in a sample that is broadly nationally representative in its composition and on key indices of smoking. Up to the start of the pandemic, the data were collected face-to-face, but of course social distancing restrictions meant no data were collected in March 2020, which was the only one we've missed since 2006. But we very quickly switched data collection to telephone interviews from April 2020 onwards. The telephone interviews use a similar sampling and weighting approach, and when we've compared data collected via the two modalities in parallel, collected during a single month in March 2020, key socio-demographic and smoking-related variables were pretty similar, so we can be reasonably confident that this methodological change hasn't had a substantial impact on the series we've been collecting. The study was established back in 2006 by Robert and has been primarily funded by CI UK. In preparing this talk, I did a bit of archival research and dug out the paper copies of the original ethics application and first questionnaires from almost 20 years ago. So I suppose that's one for toolkit enthusiasts in the unlikely event that they exist. It's now collected data from over 375,000 people on smoking and a range of related variables, including use of nicotine products, quitting activity, and use of support, as well as a range of socio-demographic information. Since 2014, it's also been the sister survey to the Alcohol Toolkit study, which means those same respondents also provide data on alcohol consumption and related variables. Finally, we're often asked why the name toolkit. Well, the study is intended to be an open toolkit or resource for policymakers, practitioners and collaborators to freely use the data we collect and who are encouraged to apply and use funding for additional questions on specific issues beyond the core focus of our study. And then, of course, those new questions benefit freely from the context of all our ongoing assessment. So if anyone is interested in working with us, please do get in touch. One recent example is that Vioni Brose, Anne McNeil and Debbie Robson from King's obtained UK PRP funding to include measures of mental health status for 3 or 4 years to examine its association with smoking, cessation, harm reduction activity. In addition to using those data to address their core research questions, we, led by Sarah Jackson, have recently been able to collaborate and take advantage of those additional data to undertake an analysis of trends in psychological distress since the start of the pandemic by a range of key potential moderators, including smoking status. It was published, I think, last month or maybe 2 months ago now, and received some media coverage reporting a substantial rise in severe distress since the start of the pandemic, particularly among young adults. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. And distress was also persistently higher among current than never smokers. So now moving on to the value of establishing this surveillance. For context, as many of you may know, the government set England a smoke-free target by 2030, which means overall smoking prevalence being less than 5%. However, that ambition won't be realised on the current trajectory. Prevalence has been recently declining by only about 0.5 percentage points each year, which would mean the target not being reached for more than 50 years in some less advantaged groups, such as those in social housing or with mental illness, who are starting from much higher prevalence levels. Worse still, I suspect that existing trajectory may be optimistic. The recent 0.5% a year decline probably reflects the long-term influence of many tobacco control policies and initiatives over the last 10-15 years. I think that's a stretching assumption. It would continue without further action. We know from a long-term analysis of trends Emma Beard led going back to 1973 that declines in smoking in England actually plateaued during the 1990s in the absence of action, and only accelerated again around 2000 following sustained tobacco control initiatives. As such, given that relatively limited time we have now until 2030, there's an urgent need for innovative tobacco control policies, I would argue critically allied with this sort of rapid monitoring and evaluation, the type enabled by Toolkit, and subsequent refinement and further innovation as required. So here are a few examples of studies that have relied on data from the STS. We've published on the impacts of the implementation of smoke-free legislation on quit attempts, change in age of sale from 16 to 18 on long-term trends in youth smoking, the first Stoptober campaign in 2012 on quit attempts, partial point of sale display ban in 2012 on prevalence trends, and later the introduction of standardised packaging between 2016 and 17 also on prevalence trends. And most recently we've assessed the extent to which menthol smoking has persisted in England since its ban in 2020. Clearly lots of important, great work has been published on all these by other groups, but hopefully these illustrate the track record of Toolkit as an evaluation tool and breadth of our interest in different tobacco control approaches. I now just want to elaborate only on the Stoptober example. So Stoptober is I know many of you know, but is a smoking cessation mass media campaign that encourages smokers to abstain from smoking for 28 days during the month of October and directs people towards a suite of digital and in-person support. STS research provided two stimuli for the first campaign in 2012. The first was a previous evaluation led by Daniel Kotz using Toolkit data showing a national cessation campaign was cost effective in England called No Smoking Day, but I think running in March or April, that also aimed to help smokers stop by providing a nationally supportive environment. And secondly, we also pointed out that autumn in England up to that point was a pretty fallow period for quitting activity. So this led to the idea of a national cessation campaign to generate a burst of activity around that time. A bit of inside baseball here. I seem to remember, maybe Martin does too, it was originally set to be named Stoptember, but you know how timelines can get a bit squeezed, and Stoptober and October worked equally well. We subsequently assessed the effectiveness and showed that in 2012 there was an approximately 50% increase in quitting during October compared with other months of that same year, whereas in 2007 to 2011 the rate in October was actually marginally less than in the other months of the same period. Using then a standard cost effectiveness model proposed by John Stapleton, Stoptober is estimated to have generated an additional 350,000 quit attempts and saved 10,400 discounted life years in that first year. Our evaluation of its first year of operation, I think, was quite influential in it continuing in England, and subsequently in work led by Myrta Kuipers, we found that the effect persisted through to 2017, but was more pronounced when campaign budgets were larger. And other countries latterly set up similar campaigns, partly off the back of this evaluation. This type of evaluation work underpinned our input into recently supporting Action on Smoking and Health and the all-party parliamentary group on smoking and health with modelling the impact of various new tobacco control policies. That modelling work was led by Emma Beard. It's all available on Open Science Framework, and helped them produce a set of recommendations for a comprehensive approach aiming to drive smoking prevalence below 5% by 2030, and included recommendations for new funding for substantial mass media campaigns, properly funding the first-rate stop smoking services, and consult on raising the age of sale from 18 to 21. Okay, so I'll now talk a bit about the examples of how the studies enabled us to provide some insights into fast-emerging phenomena by presenting on the latest trends in the use of e-cigarettes, particularly recent developments on disposables, which have just been in the news again this morning. So before getting on to these trends, just to say, I will present probably quite a lot of information, but if anything's unclear, you can always visit our website, smokinginengland.info, and view almost all the graphs I'm about to present at your leisure. Any not on the website I'll reference, they might be in some specific papers, and the website is updated every month with the previous month's estimates. Also in 2020, we started collecting equivalent data in Wales and Scotland in late 2020, which you can also see at their equivalent websites. However, I won't be covering these today as my focus is on longer term trends. So, going back some time, Robert and Jenny first added a question about e-cigarettes to the Smoking Toolkit study in 2009. And these data show the use of e-cigarettes among smokers who've attempted to stop in the past year and specifically report having used it to support or aid their quit attempt. As we all now know, there was that period of really dramatic growth between 2011 and 2013, and then followed by a period of slightly slower growth, and then their popularity declined from a peak probably in about 2016, before we started to see them rising again since 2021. Just quickly, here are the equivalent trends in the use of a variety of other quitting methods. I think seeing these figures illustrates how e-cigarettes rapidly, within 2 years, went from being the least to the most popular method by which people are attempting to quit in England, quickly overtaking much more established and widely advertised methods. So I was working on the study by this stage, and when we first started to see a small uptick in the use of e-cigarettes in a quit attempt, we expanded the toolkit in early 2011 to ask also about current use of e-cigarettes. Initially, this was still limited to past year smokers, so both current smokers and those who've stopped only in the past year. And from these data, again, you can see clearly that current use increased rapidly between 2011 and 2013, but growth thereafter was pretty minimal, with prevalence fairly stable from 2013 to the end of 2020. And then since 2021, prevalence has been increasing again and stands now at around a third of past year smokers reporting current use in the second quarter of 2023. So, as we saw e-cigarettes becoming more popular among smokers, there was clearly an increasing need to monitor the extent to which there was use by non-smokers. So in 2013, we expanded again to assess current use among all adults now. And this graph shows data on the current use of e-cigarettes among the nearly 200,000 adults we surveyed since November 2013 through to June this year. And these data show that the use of e-cigarettes overall remained relatively stable, at around 5% of the total English population, up to the end of around 2020. And again, we see that growth over the past 2 to 3 years to approximately 12%, as is our most recent estimate. However, as I'm sure you'd all expect, this overall prevalence masks very different patterns by different smoking status. So between 2013 and the end of 2020, I think we have a fairly consistent pattern by the different smoking status. Use among past year smokers is fairly stable, again around that 20%. Use among never smokers is consistently rare, in green at less than 1% up to 2020, while there's been a steady growth in the use of e-cigarettes among long-term ex-smokers. The steady growth among long-term ex-smokers likely reflects cohorts of smokers who stop successfully with e-cigarettes and then continue using them while gradually accumulating years of abstinence and making up an increasing proportion of long-term ex-smokers. Of course, the other way might be long-term ex-smokers just start using them, but to support that first interpretation, we can split long-term ex-smokers into those who've stopped, for example, in the past 1 to 5 years, shown in the solid blue line, and those who've been ex-smokers for more than 5 years in the dotted line. And again, you can see quite different patterns. So crucially, we can see very little use by smokers with more than 5 years of abstinence until around late 2016, which is exactly 5 years after the time that e-cigarettes first started to become popular for being used in a quit attempt. And then you see that pretty steady growth thereafter, presumably as later cohorts of smokers who stop successfully with e-cigarettes begin accumulating those years of abstinence. So the upshot of all these patterns up to 2020, remember, rare use of e-cigarettes among never smokers, increasing use of e-cigarettes among long-term ex-smokers, alongside a pretty stable prevalence among past year smokers, was that there was a gradual widening in the prevalence of people using nicotine from any source and the prevalence of people using cigarettes, or an increasing proportion of people using much less harmful source of nicotine. At the same time, there were long-term declines in the prevalence of both through to the end of 2020. So what changed in 2021? Well, the recent rise in the prevalence of e-cigarette use has followed a pretty clear gradient, with rates rising most rapidly among under 35, so 16, 24, and 25 to 30, you can see there, while changing very little among the oldest age groups. You can see 65 plus at the bottom. Study led by Harry Tatton-Birch indicated this has been driven by new disposable e-cigarettes rapidly becoming popular, particularly among young adults, with the proportion of vapers reporting mainly using disposables rising very quickly throughout 2021 and 2022, and recent data suggests that trend's continued into 2023. So to quickly explain what we mean by new disposables, so a lot of early e-cigarettes were also disposable devices, but those closely resembled cigarettes. They're often called cigar-likes, and were relatively poor at delivering nicotine, so they didn't really prove very popular. Subsequent generations of e-cigarettes were developed that were variously rechargeable, included refillable tanks or replaceable cartridges and later pods, and typically delivered nicotine more effectively than the earlier devices. So this new form of disposables, which we've seen become very popular in England, typically delivers nicotine effectively by using similar technology to pod devices, including a relatively high strength nicotine salt, sold very cheaply for as little as $2.99, but pretty commonly $4.99, $5.99, and under a variety of brand names. I think pretty popular ones: Crystal Bar, Elf Bar, Lost Mary. So this graph shows the prevalence of vaping by different device types only among never smokers. Okay, so please do note the axis. Prevalence is still only around 3% in 2023, so I don't want to overstate that, but equally the change since 2021 is pretty stark and clearly driven primarily by the popularity of disposables in blue. So it's overall in red and disposables in blue. It's also true that although that percentage is quite small, 3% is quite rare, never smokers clearly represent approximately 60% of the 45 million adults in England, which means about 1.4 million never smokers currently using e-cigarettes. And again, this is more pronounced among young never smokers. The axis has changed again there. So with around 9% of never smoking 16 to 24-year-olds currently using e-cigarettes in 2023, with again the great majority of those using disposables in dark blue. It's also worth noting that these data are pretty current. They go right up to June 2023, and we're still not really yet seeing clear signs of that growth slowing down, I don't think. And we've previously published on this in US data, but this graph makes the point that actually in 2023, it isn't just experimental use among never smokers either. Clearly it's still much less than among people with smoking history, but it's about 65% of current e-cigarettes users with no history of smoking reported using their e-cigarette at least daily, and a further 20% at least weekly. Here are equivalent figures for current, recent X and long-term X smokers, and it's clear disposables have also proven extremely popular among current and recent X smokers. However, it's also apparent that they're not yet widely used by long-term X smokers, shown on the right of the slide. And remember, we saw from earlier graphs that it appears the primary way in which e-cigarette use appears in long-term ex-smokers is for smokers to quit using an e-cigarette and then gradually accumulate those years of abstinence. So if there are to be policies targeted to reduce the appeal and attractiveness of disposables, then I'd say it'd probably be wise for such policies to occur sooner rather than later, before they're widely popular, particularly with long-term ex-smokers, and there may be fewer unintended consequences there. Now, final one for this section, if we revisit the use of cigarettes, e-cigarettes, or the use of either, but stratified by age, we see a couple of quite interesting things, I think. First, the increase in levels of using either is most pronounced in young people, so top left, 16 to 24. But also, second, a suggestion of a possible trade-off. We're doing some formal analyses on these two, led by Harry Tatton-Birch and Sarah Jackson, but they're quite uncertain at this stage. But I think there is a suggestion that young adults may have been excluded from the stagnation in the rate of decline in smoking prevalence we've seen in other age groups since the start of the pandemic. In other words, the smoking prevalence in red since the pandemic appears to have been pretty flat in older adults at the bottom of this panel, as has their e-cigarette prevalence, whereas in younger adults since 2020, smoking prevalence has still been declining. At the same time, we're seeing these substantial increases in the use of e-cigarettes. However, the prevalence of smoking or using e-cigarettes also appears to have increased quite substantially in that same period, to the extent that, for example, approximately a third of 16 to 24-year-olds reported using either in 2023. And as I said before, little sign of that growth slowing down yet. Insofar that all of that's true, I think there's some difficult trade-off decisions in terms of policies. Sorry, I've got a couple more. Finally, in a recent analysis, we've been looking at changes in where people have been buying their e-cigarettes over time, and you can see there are very different patterns. Vape shops, shown in the purple line, were the most common source of purchase up to the start of the pandemic, but social distancing measures introduced in 2020 meant a lot of vape shops were forced to close, and that saw a surge in online sales, shown in turquoise. But while online sales quite quickly returned to baseline levels by 2022, after people started returning to normal life, vape shop purchasing didn't really recover and was instead displaced by the quite rapid rise in purchasing you can see from supermarkets and newsagents and so on in blue, which are now the most common source of purchase of e-cigarettes. When we had a more detailed look at changes by user and device characteristics, we saw that this rise in supermarket purchasing was most pronounced among younger vapers here, and those who reported mainly using disposable e-cigarettes, consistent again with this also kind of being a disposable effects. And displays of colourful disposable vapes like this are pretty commonplace in supermarkets. I'm sure lots of people will have seen them in the audience. So, to summarise, in England, e-cigarette use grew very rapidly between 2011 and 2013, quickly becoming the most popular quitting method. Overall prevalence in all adults was relatively stable thereafter, at least up till the end of 2020. But as new disposable e-cigarette products have rapidly become popular among young people over the last couple of years, the overall prevalence of e-cigarette use among adults has risen again since 2021. So we saw the stability and overall prevalence for a large part of the last decade obscured different patterns among people with different smoking status. Specifically, we saw current use of e-cigarettes by never smokers remained rare up to late 2020, but that's risen to approximately 3% with the advent of new disposables. Growth in past year smokers stalled between 2013 and 2020, but is now rising again. Meanwhile, use among ex-smokers, particularly long-term ex-smokers, continue to increase. At the same time, long-term cigarette smoking prevalence across the whole period declined, and smoking represents a declining proportion of people who use nicotine. But the decline in smoking prevalence, I think, may have stalled in the last couple of years, with that possible exception of young people. It's uncertain whether it's related, but remember, it's also young people who saw the sharpest increases in the use of e-cigarettes recently. And the trade-off may be increases in the prevalence of people using either cigarettes or e-cigarettes, which has also been most pronounced in young people and is not yet showing signs of slowing down. Now moving to the final section, I'll discuss how we've evaluated the effectiveness of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation as an example of using Toolkit to triangulate with other sources of evidence. I'll just cover this briefly because I think you'll hear in more detail in Nicola's keynote. But Jamie Hartman-Boyce and colleagues published the latest version of their fantastic Cochrane Living Review of e-cigarettes in November last year. In the main meta-analysis, you can see cessation was significantly greater in people randomised to e-cigarettes than those to NRT. Risk ratio was 1.62, and they also graded the evidence as high certainty for the first time. So we have high certainty evidence from RCTs that e-cigarettes are more effective for cessation than NRT, and that would seem quite conclusive, especially as the comparator is NRT, which we know from over 100 trials is significantly more effective than placebo. So why might we still want evidence from observational data? Well, as so eloquently argued in this really great Nature comment by Marcus Manafo and George Davey-Smith in 2018, robust research requires triangulation. Any given approach has its own related assumptions, strengths, weaknesses, but results that agree across different methodologies are more likely to be robust and generalizable. In this specific context, RCTs of e-cigarettes are obviously a fantastic evidence source, but are arguably somewhat limited by generalizability outside that clinical trial context. For example, most e-cigarette use in the real world doesn't involve any engagement with health professionals. And how do people actually use e-cigarettes in the real world, and how do we account for the variety of model types and so on? So comparative individual level epidemiology can help. As I'm sure lots of you are familiar and many of you have published on, there's a long history of this approach. We reported one of the early ones back in 2014, and then Sarah updated it in 2019, having accrued a larger number of participants, and we found that after adjustment for important confounders, so characteristics that affect both the chance of quitting successfully and also the likelihood of people electing to use an e-cigarette, that the real-world effect appeared similar to that in trials, with people using an e-cigarette in a quit attempt almost twice as likely to report being successful than those who didn't use an e-cigarette. However, other studies have presented a more mixed picture, with others failing to find an effect or even a reduced likelihood of future quitting. There's been much discussion by lots of people in this room about possible reasons for the discrepancy. Without going into detail, I'd argue that studies which report negative associations tend to control less well for confounding, particularly dependence, or focus on use of e-cigarettes in the past outside a quit attempt, which creates a type of selection bias. A review by David Abrams and colleagues covers those issues nicely, I think. Even the best of those types of studies, which include lots of important confounders and treat selection bias carefully, are still limited by the possibility that those using e-cigarettes may be more likely to succeed because of unmeasured confounding. Whereas aggregated time series, by definition, involve estimates of the whole population, and so there can be none of that individual level confounding. Here are some relevant time series. In brown, you can see the increased popularity of the use of e-cigarettes in quit attempts against changes in the overall success rate of quit attempts in the population of England in red. So I think you can observe before form an analysis that on average quit success was pretty flat between 2007 and 2011, clearly a bit of noise, but at an average of around 13 to 14%. And thereafter, there appears to have been a small increase coinciding with the rise in e-cigarettes to more like 17%. That's suggestive, positive impact of e-cigarettes on quitting, but clearly eyeballing like this, or even simple correlation, would be a bit too simplistic. However, because we collect these data monthly at the population level and have done now for the last 17 years, we've got this long series of fine-grained data on which we can do some really quite powerful time series analysis to try to formally assess the association between quarterly changes in the prevalence of e-cigarette use with different outcome measures of quitting activity. We, led by Dr. Emma Beard, used an Aramax modelling approach, which allows you to put in adjustments for other factors that you think might be important, such as tobacco control policies, and for seasonal and long-term secular trends, and the underlying structure of the data. And if after accounting for these features there remains an association, then some more persuasive causal inference. When we modelled using this time series approach, we found that overall success rates increased by 0.58% for every 1% increase in the prevalence of e-cigarette use during a quit. So significant, but probably a more modest result that remains after accounting for all those factors than you might have assumed when just eyeballing the unadjusted trends. Updates using data up to the end of 2017 and 2022 with larger samples and over periods where different types of devices have been popular show a broadly consistent pattern of results. Point estimate of the effect size was slightly smaller in the most recent update, but the confidence intervals overlapped and there were some methodological differences, which mean they're not entirely comparable across the three studies. Now, of course, these time series also have their own limitations. For example, the possibility of population-level confounding, such as the introduction of other health policies that may have affected overall quitting rates, which we didn't model. And in theory, they may also be affected by changes in the demographic or smoking profiles of the population. However, those changes wouldn't affect clinical trials or the comparative observational studies. So taken together, I think we've got three sources of information: the trials, the observational studies, population-level studies, each with their own limitations, but together providing quite powerful triangulation on the true effect size of e-cigarettes on smoking cessation. So what to make of these results? Remember, in our first time series analysis, we found overall success rates increased by 0.58% for every 1% increase in the prevalence of e-cig use in a quit attempt. And on the assumption that association was causal and that around 1 million smokers reported using e-cigarettes in a quit attempt in 2015, then that translates to an additional 54,000 medium-term ex-smokers attributable to e-cigarette use. And please note that's an estimate for the number of additional ex-smokers, so over and above the quitting activity before they're becoming widely popular. If we use the estimate from our most recent update, recent analysis, which was 0.4%, and assume around 700,000 smokers used an e-cigarette in a quit attempt during 2022, then that translates to an additional 28,000 ex-smokers, slightly lower due to that slightly smaller point estimate and the smaller population of smokers remaining in 2022. Okay. Collectively, these analyses suggest that the use of e-cigarettes in quit attempts has helped in the region of 30,000 to 50,000 additional smokers to successfully quit each year in England since they became popular, and those population results are broadly consistent with models at the individual level that assume e-cigarettes increase success for each individual by about 1.5 to 2 times. Some people have argued these numbers are relatively small since there remain about 5 million smokers in England, but insofar that they are accurate, they are meaningful and clinically significant, clearly, because of the huge health gains and life years associated with those tens of thousands of additional smokers stopping each year. Also, clearly the absolute number of people stopping with e-cigarettes is certainly much greater than our estimate. From earlier graphs, should be clear there are millions of ex-smokers using e-cigarettes, given use is around 15% of all long-term ex-smokers. However, large numbers of smokers were stopping successfully before e-cigarettes, and therefore our estimate assumes a proportion of those, of that absolute number, would likely have found an alternative way to stop in their absence. People can disagree with that assumption, but that's what it is. So it's an estimate of those who stopped over and above what was going on previously. Finally, it's worth remembering the climate in which we observed these associations. It is at least possible the contribution may have been even greater if messaging to the general public had been clearer. Unfortunately, I think there's a case to be made that much communication on e-cigarettes remains closer to that yellow sign than would be ideal. If you note how the sign focuses on its ever so dangerous sharp edges, while the really crucial message about the really dangerous bridge being out ahead is only mentioned at the very bottom in tiny print. To illustrate this point, here are some results from a new study led by Sarah Jackson. Since we began measuring it at the end of 2014, we find that a declining minority of current smokers believe e-cigarettes are less harmful than cigarettes, shown in green, while there have been increases overall in the proportion who believe they're equally or more harmful, shown in yellow and red, with particular bumps corresponding broadly to coverage of EVALI in 2019, which was wrongly attributed to nicotine e-cigarettes, and more recently with lots of negative media coverage of the increases in youth vaping, which many of us here in the UK will have seen. So these misperceptions are worrying, as we know that e-cigarettes are less harmful, but only about 30% of smokers in England currently believe that, and it's actually even less, more like 20% among those who don't vape. So to summarise, results from two different methods corroborate RCT data that e-cigarettes are effective for cessation, and modelling suggests e-cigarettes produced an additional tens of thousands of ex-smokers annually in England through to 2022. So in this context, let's revisit some of those trends we covered in the second part of the talk. Remember, we saw that in England, e-cigarette use grew rapidly between 2011 and 2013, and then overall prevalence broadly stabilised between 2013 and late 2020. And beyond that overall figure, we saw that use among never smokers was very rare, while use among long-term ex-smokers gradually increased from low levels. This also contributed to a long-term decline in smoking prevalence during the same period. So I think so far, so good. I think at this stage, the regulation of e-cigarettes in England are pretty effectively balancing the opportunities for adults to quit while minimising risks of people who've never smoked, especially young people, from using them. However, since new disposable devices started to become widely popular in 2021, I think there's been substantial changes in the number of underlying trends, most notably increases in use among never smokers, especially young people, which has also meant there's been a sizable increase in the prevalence of young people using either cigarettes or e-cigarettes. Despite there being some uncertain evidence, I mentioned that this has occurred at the same time as smoking declining more quickly among those same young people recently. I think that outcome trade-off is unlikely to be politically acceptable and is uncertain and risky in terms of its public health impact, especially when it's not yet clear that the growth in prevalence has peaked, I don't think. In this context, I think it's likely that further proportionate regulations, not bans, I don't think, but of the type proposed earlier this year by ASH, including immediate tax and promotion measures intended to try to reduce the appeal and availability of these new devices specifically to never smokers, may help better realise the potential of e-cigarettes to improve public health in England. And it'd be important, as Ash argued too, for this to occur alongside measures to also encourage and enable their use specifically by adult smokers as effective cessation aids. So returning, last slide, to the aim of my talk, I very much hope that I've persuaded you of the value of establishing frequent, rapid and detailed surveillance of smoking. I showed how toolkits enabled some rapid evaluation and policy impact by considering a number of examples, including Stoptober. Next, I illustrated how toolkits provided us with lots of early insights into fast emerging phenomena, particularly e-cigarettes and recent developments in the use of disposables. And finally, I just covered how the study enabled us to use different approaches to real-world evaluation of effectiveness and how they can be used together with RCT evidence to triangulate on estimates for effectiveness. As I said at the outset, although I probably set myself quite a low bar given your sympathies, but hopefully these specific examples, when brought together, may enable some of you to go away and to use this to help make cases all over Europe. Daniel Kotz and colleagues have established a similar project in Germany called DEBRA, which provides rapidly reported and bi-monthly surveillance there and has proved an invaluable resource. And there are, of course, many wonderful surveillance and evaluation projects globally, not least the fantastic ITC project, which has had an immeasurable impact on the field. I'm just making the case that this type of frequent rapid surveillance can uniquely enhance and complement those other vital efforts. And happily, since submitting a title for this talk, I read that the FDA and NIH have just invested 18 million in a new centre for rapid surveillance of tobacco, I think to be led by Christine Del Nevo. And this is a wonderful development. So here's a quick video of my boys cheering the good news as the budding nicotine and tobacco researchers they are. Definitely not celebrating a famous Tottenham victory against Man City that we'd just witnessed. Bit off topic, I know, but I promised I'd find a way to include them. So back on topic, I know this new centre will be a fantastic resource for US colleagues, and I'm eagerly anticipating the impact it will have on the field, and hope alongside the English and German experiences can really act as a catalyst for many more countries to invest and enable more effective tobacco control policies through rapid and frequent surveillance, evaluation and refinement. I'll finish by leaving up some acknowledgements. As Anne says, I think the format means we're not having questions, but please do be on touch on email or over Twitter, or ask me over a coffee during the rest of the conference. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jamie. That was truly brilliant, terribly informative and comprehensive, and so stimulating. So lots of food for thought as you go on for the next 2 days of the conference. Thank you so much. I think you missed out one thing. It really needs people like you to be able to analyse the data so thoroughly as you have done. So thank you so much. There's 3 different sessions now, so please make your way to the other 2 rooms if you're not in here, or stay in here if you're for that. And thank you once again for joining.